Hello, YouTube! Today we are watching This Story Exposes the Truth About Mount Everest Industry. I was really interested in this one because I've been watching a lot of videos about Mount Everest and things like that. So, honestly, I can't wait to see what they're gonna be talking about. Might turn it up a little bit.
In this video, you're going to see some of the most disturbing photos in Mount Everest history, but not for the reasons that you might expect. Take this photo right here, for example. This man found himself laying just below the summit of Mount Everest, unable to move, knowing that he was literally about to die. His oxygen was gone, his hands were frozen, help was not coming, and so as his final act, he pulled out his satellite phone and he called his pregnant wife for the very last time. From over 10,000 miles away, she begged him to keep fighting,
Oh
but
no.
he knew that he wouldn't be making it down the mountain. And so instead, they used their final conversation to name their future daughter. They then said their goodbyes, and he slowly froze to death. Folks, this was not just a climbing accident. This was a disaster, a full-scale disaster, set in motion by ego, money, and good old-fashioned rivalry. Two of the most famous Mount Everest guides, once allies, now competitors, led their teams into chaos during the 1996 season. Clients were trapped, Sherpas were stranded, and multiple
Wow.
people never made it off the mountain. Some of
Even
them
the
were
Sherpas?
abandoned, and others were just simply left to die. And the worst part is that, well, none of this had to happen. Folks, be sure to watch until the very end of the video.
No, that's wild. Is that it was all because of human error. But oh no. RIP people. Alright, let's see what's gonna happen.
Because I need to tell you, man, in the midst of all this chaos, one man, who was left for dead, mind you, managed to pull off what is probably the most shocking and, frankly, legendary act in all of Mount Everest history. And so with all that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to Mount Everest. Now, this
Oh
trip is
wow.
totally free, but you have to hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. We're trying to get this channel to 1 million subscribers before the end of the year, and frankly, we have a long ways to go, and so I would really appreciate that. Okay. In the spring of 1996, the south side of Everest was packed, like straight up packed. There were more expeditions happening than ever before, with more options for experienced guides and larger parties heading up the mountain. A young writer from Outside Magazine named John Krakauer, perhaps you've heard of him, was among the crowd doing a story on the rising popularity of Everest. To him, two particular climbing groups stood out, both led by men at pretty much the height of their careers, who each understood the value of getting a great review in John's article.
Oh, the best of
Remember
the
these names
best.
because you're going to hear them a lot as this video goes on. First, we have Rob Hall. Rob was a New Zealander, and he was the leader of
Oh.
Adventure Consultants. Rob had the reputation of being this incredible planner, and also for staying calm and, most importantly, keeping people safe no matter what. He attracted clients from all around the world, people like Doug Hansen, for instance, who was a postal worker from Washington who was making his second attempt on the summit. Another notable client was Yasuko Namba, who was a Japanese businesswoman on the verge of completing her quest to reach the 7 summits. That's the
Wow.
highest mountain in every single continent. Now, the other name you need to remember.
I would also like to add an interesting note about Mount Everest is that it's a several month journey going up this mountain. It honestly feels like a waste of time. I wouldn't recommend it. I feel like you could do so much more with your life rather than just climbing a mountain that's littered and should stay pristine and taken care of since it's part of nature. But it's the fact that they have to set up camps and then you have to go up and then you have to go back down. So you're supposed to adjust to the oxygen levels and you have to do this several times. So you're going up, then you're going down, then you go up again. You do that a few times in the same spot, and then finally you start doing an ascent to a higher ground and then going back down. It's all on a repeat. It's crazy. I didn't realize Mount Everest required so much ability and oxygen and everything. Hello, Bar Lee Rari. Sorry, I'm messing up your name. Welcome.
Remember that you're going to hear about throughout this video was a man named Scott Fisher, who, like Rob Hall, was basically a Mount Everest legend. However, Scott was a legend for completely different reasons. He was a very passionate dude, to be honest, to the point of being even a bit wild. Scott had this aggressive climbing style, and he knew how to push limits. Hell, he had even summited Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, which is something that is just insane, and honestly something that Rob Hall had never dared to try.
Wow.
And so with this different attitude and climbing style, Scott Fisher attracted a very different type of client, like Pete Schoenig, for instance.
You need to know how to breathe up there. It's high elevation.
Glory climb. Oh, and clients like Sandy Pittman, for instance,
Wow,
who was
glory
a
to
socialite
high.
who carried a 20-pound satellite phone with her. So
Wow, she has a phone?
from Mount Everest
Satellite?
to the internet.
That's
He was
next
working with
level.
NBC for this. Both Rob Hall and Scott Fisher wanted John Krakauer, the writer, to join their expeditions, obviously. But John would ultimately choose to go with Rob, who he thought was meticulous, as opposed to Scott Fisher, who was more hands-off and my words, but maybe a little more reckless. Scott and Rob were friends with each other, but they were now competitors. And when John Krakauer decided to go with Rob's expedition, let's just say that Scott Fisher wasn't super happy about this. I don't want to make this drama out to be more than it actually is. Like, it was fine, but, you know, Scott obviously would have preferred to have this famous journalist who was writing this massive piece go with his expedition. But regardless, Scott still had a job to do. He had to get his clients up and down Everest, and now he had this added challenge, the added weight, you could say, of showing that his business was worth the price and worth the future trust of clients like John. The bottom line here is that Rob Hall and Scott Fisher both had lots of eyes on them. They had John's article. They had Sandy's online diary through NBC. I mean, they could literally change how the world sees Mount Everest and put millions of dollars into their pockets through future expeditions.
So it's like tourism.
And so the stakes were obviously extremely high. So now that I've kind of set the stage for you, we're about to get into the absolute chaos that unfolded on Everest in 1996. And trust me, it's fascinating, but it's pretty bad. And so I do want to take a second to kind of like bring the temperature down and talk about something way more fun, which is gummy bears. Specifically, the kind that make your body work better. Groons is the sponsor of this video, and honestly, they've been a big part of me taking my health more seriously. The older I get, and yes, I'm somehow 29, back into the biggest disaster in Mount Everest history.
There we go.
The 1996 climbs began as many of them do, right? I'm talking weeks of acclimating to elevation, journeys through the notorious Khumbu icefall, which looks insane, and work to establish camps higher and higher up the mountain. During these early days, the weather was pretty good, and spirits in both parties, Rob's and Scott's, were pretty high. But that's not to say that things were perfect. There were some issues here and there, things like delays from broken ropes that had to be fixed by Sherpas, and also more climbers on the mountain meant more bottlenecks, which of course ate up time and made the summit window more and more narrow. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the photos of people like waiting in line on Mount Everest. And perhaps more concerningly is that some climbers were already starting to struggle with the altitude. And
altitude sickness.
Oxygen supplies. Hell, a few even would end up turning back, which included the 68-year-old Pete, who Scott Fisher personally took down himself before he climbed all the way back up to rejoin the rest of his clients, which is insane, all right? I mean, that was kind of just Scott's way. He would push the limits, and he really wanted to show his clients that he was the best guide on the mountain. Both Scott's and Rob's expeditions made it together all the way up to Camp 4, which is about 26,000 feet above sea level, or just below 8,000 meters. And at this point, everyone was focused on the finale, Summit Day, right? What they came there to do in the first place. In the early morning hours of May 10th, 1996, both expeditions began their summit of Mount Everest. Conditions were not good, we'll say. A cold wind was whipping across the mountain, and visibility was getting worse as the day went on. But believe it or not, the forecast was actually calling for even worse weather in the coming
Oh
days.
no.
And that, combined with the fact that the year's climbing season was ending soon, well, that just put a lot of pressure on Scott and Rob to deliver their clients to the summit. And so both groups pressed on, despite the fact that both Scott and Rob had full knowledge of the worsening forecast. Folks, the climb that day was nothing short of agonizing. I can't even imagine, honestly. You're at the highest altitude in the entire world. Every single step hurts. The air up there is so thin that it's like running a marathon while breathing through a straw. And then you add in a time crunch. I mean, the climbers had to hustle, right? Because they were going to lose daylight. And so they decided upon this turnaround time of 2 o'clock. As the 30 or so climbers struggled up that final pass, there were even more problems that began to develop. And these were not small problems by any stretch of the imagination. I'm talking things like critical ropes that needed to be fixed in place.
This is why you do not rush. You do not rush when you're trying to do this stuff. Make sure to always take your time because lives are at stake here.
Because they simply just weren't set up right, which created delays of multiple hours as the Sherpas had to work to fix them. And of course, this forced the climbers to basically just stand around and wait while they're stuck in what's known as the death zone of Mount Everest, where you're so high that your body is literally slowly dying. When you're in the death zone, your time is limited, and it's literally the last place that you want to just be stuck waiting in line, right? And so precious hours ticked by, and a few party members eventually made the very painful decision to turn back early, mostly because they were getting low on oxygen and they just didn't want to risk it any further. But still, the two leaders, Rob and Scott, and some other employees and Sherpas, and then a smaller group of clients, pressed on, fueled by this deep-seated desire to reach the top of the world, right? I mean, that's why they came all this way. Rob Hall was the first person to find himself in a difficult position. At around the Hillary Step, the famous Hillary Step, just 200 feet from the summit of Everest, Doug Hansen, again, that postal worker from Washington, well, he was really struggling to continue on. Rob sent Sherpas and several clients ahead of him with one of his trusted employees who was named Andy Harris, while Rob himself stayed back with Doug. At the same time, just a little bit lower down on the mountain, Scott Fisher was experiencing difficulty as well, although this was different kind of difficulty. It wasn't one of his clients that was struggling, it was literally him. He was visibly weakening, showing severe signs of altitude sickness. But with that said, nothing, and I literally mean nothing, was going to stop Scott Fisher from ascending Mount Everest. One of his employees, who was named Anatoly Bokriev, would reach the summit first and organize getting as many climbers as possible up to the peak as Scott kind of lagged behind. And in the meantime, time continued to pass. First it was 2 o'clock, all of a sudden it was 2:30, next it's 3.
Oh no,
John
time is
Krakauer,
going.
who is now standing at the summit of Everest, it's right around 3:30 now, we'll say. Well, he said that the weather was starting to get very, very bad. And it's important to remember that John, well, he knew a thing or two about these dangerous climbs. He was a journalist.
Well, the ice too on the mask.
And also, he had never summited Everest before, but he was still an experienced climber. He had done the research, he had put in the work, and he knew that nobody should be ascending Everest with wind as strong as they were seeing and this blinding snow coming in at them. And so when the Sherpas urged the climbers to turn back around, Krakauer knew that something was not right. On their way down, they hustled past Doug Hansen and Rob Hall, who were still slowly climbing up towards the summit. And then finally, at 3:45, Scott Fisher himself reached the summit. The timeline is really important here. Like, I can't stress enough how late in the day they're summiting, especially in the conditions, right? In fact, Doug Hansen and Rob Hall would reach the summit even later than Scott Fisher did. And even more concerning than all of that stuff is that this massive blizzard began to just throw snow and wind onto the mountain, onto the climbers. And as this happened, neither Scott Fisher or Rob Hall had even really started to think about their descent. I mean, these two legendary leaders were now struggling right near the summit. Things are really unraveling. And so Anatoly Bokriev, who was still feeling pretty good He was in relatively good condition compared to everyone else. Well, he kind of just had no choice but to become the de facto leader of the descent. He had to make some
Wow.
decisions, and his first big decision was a bit controversial. He decided to basically speed down the mountain past all of the others so that he could reach Camp 4, with the idea being that he could kind of receive the struggling climbers as they came in and provide them with supplies once they got there. Again, these climbers are battling, say, 70-mile-per-hour winds
Oh
and,
no.
just blizzard conditions. And Anatoly Bokryev basically chose not to stay with the descending climbers and not to offer them any bottled oxygen on their way down, which to him was this like false sense of security. He didn't really think it would help. But you have to keep in mind, at 5 miles above sea level, in a giant blizzard and growing darkness around, well, I think in that circumstance, just about any security would be kind of nice. But
One thing is, when you climb Mount Everest, you're only supposed to think about yourself because your survival will depend on everybody else's survival. Because if you try to help someone up or help someone get down, that's gonna expend more energy for you, more work for you to figure out things, and it's kind of like diving too, because diving does the same thing where you can't save another person, especially if they're thrashing around. In these types of situations, you're always gonna want to prioritize your own survival first, because if someone's struggling and you're struggling yourself, you can't help them. They're gonna make you sink. They're gonna make you deal with a lot. And thanks for the head pats.
maybe that's just me. And speaking of that, I want to make something clear here. I'm sure most of you already realize this, but I'm not a mountaineer. I've never summited Everest, and I never will. And so you
Hmm.
should take any critiques that I make with a massive grain of salt, frankly. I base these critiques off of what other much more qualified people have said, but
Yeah.
still, since it's coming out of my mouth, yeah, just, I don't know. Anyways, as the sun went down and visibility became basically impossible, let's be honest, some of the climbers became separated. The conditions were
Oh.
beyond treacherous at this point. Everyone was in survival mode, and so each person's priority was just to reach Camp 4 first, get stabilized, we'll say, and then go help the
Yep.
missing climbers. I mean, this is just an abysmal situation,
Hmm.
right? What had started as this like hopeful summit day of the tallest mountain in the world, this huge accomplishment, had turned into every climber's worst nightmare, with the looming threat of mass casualties. I need to
Everyone
go
for
back to the big picture for a
themselves.
second. And so, as all of this is going down, about 1,000 feet above Camp 4, he found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. There was actually a Sherpa with him who was trying to help him down, but as night fell, Scott just couldn't overcome his altitude symptoms and he
Oh
just could
no.
not go any further. And so he convinced the Sherpa to just leave him, essentially, to go down ahead of him, at least to save the Sherpa's life, right? And
Yeah.
after this, he basically
See?
just braced himself for
That's how it
a
be.
very long night ahead of him. Even higher up on the mountain, Rob Hall stayed with Doug Hansen near the Hillary Step, again, almost at the summit. And at this point, Doug fell completely unconscious.
Oh
And so
no.
Rob radioed down to his employee, Andy Harris again, who hadn't made it all the way down to Camp 4 yet. Rob asked Andy to bring oxygen supplies and water up to their position so that they could, save Doug's life and bring him back down the mountain. At this point, it's about 5:30 p.m., and the blizzard
Oh
is
wow.
at its
It's
most
late.
intense moment. So Rob radios down to Andy, but this call would turn out to be a very fateful one because Andy never made it back up to
Oh
the Hillary Step. The mountain
no.
basically swallowed him whole, and Andy remains missing to this very day. Finally, around midnight, the blizzard finally calmed down just a little bit. It's at this point that Anatoly Bokryev and some of the other survivors began searching for all of these missing climbers. And despite the fact that they themselves were extremely exhausted, they were able to find several people from Scott Fisher's roster and successfully bring them down to camp. And they
Wow.
even found one climber from Rob Hall's group, who Bokryev said was basically just too close to death for rescuing.
Oh
This climber
no.
was Yasko Namba, again, the Japanese businesswoman. And they basically made the very difficult and controversial decision to just leave her there. Like, there was nothing that they could do. It would be too dangerous, for their own lives to risk trying to
Yeah.
save her at this point, which might
That's
sound
sad.
really bad, but the truth is that this happens on Mount Everest
Yep.
more often than I think
Mm-hmm.
people would like to admit. In the early morning hours of May 11th, so now the next day, a radio call came into base camp from the South Summit, which again is only, say 120 feet or about 50 meters lower than the Hillary Step. The radio call was from Rob Hall, who had somehow survived the night. Rob reported that Doug had died, and also that Andy Harris had never made it back up to him. Rob was somewhat able to fix his oxygen mask, but his hands were totally frostbitten at this
Oh
point.
no.
And he reported that he just didn't have it in him to continue climbing down the mountain. And so it's at this point that we're going to go back to the very beginning of the video. It's at this point that Rob's call was forwarded to his wife, his pregnant wife, who was back home in New Zealand. And the couple briefly spoke. They named their unborn child, and Rob told his wife that though he was gonna die, at least he was comfortable. The call ended,
Wow.
and then Rob Hall fell asleep, and he froze to death. Back down at Camp
Wow.
4, the mood was obviously very somber. The survivors learned that Rob Hall had died, and at this point, it was kind of just settling in that, well, this was a massive disaster. This wasn't just, a little accident or one or two people dying. Like, this was a full-scale disaster. For a moment, things almost looked up when everybody learned that Scott Fisher was still alive somehow, like he had made it through the night. But this miracle was soon crushed because they ended up sending a search team up to him, and unfortunately, when they found him, they only made it in time to essentially just give him end-of-life care. And so Scott Fisher also died on the mountain that morning. That's two titans of Everest climbing completely gone in almost the blink of an eye.
Because it was all the weather too. See, nature can take anyone. If the
With
weather
that
gets
said, there were
cold,
still more
too
missing
late.
climbers out there, and maybe, just maybe, more lives that could be saved, right? One of the clients who had turned back early from Everest the day before actually heroically
Yeah, you're right,
chose to
creator.
go out and search. He would end up coming upon Yasko Namba, who, to his surprise, was actually with another climber. And this climber was named Beck Weathers. At this point, both of them were somehow still clinging on to life,
Wow.
but they were severely frostbitten, mostly
You know what I really love is the human perseverance in being able to handle a lot of things. Like, there have been people that have gone through the most serious and most terrible things before. Like, when I'm talking about serious injuries, serious life threatening things, and they've persevered. It's incredible. Nothing can really stop them, especially if they're in a healthy level of body and everything.
unresponsive, and they were literally gasping for air. Remember, the air is so thin up here, it's just brutal.
Resilience.
Unfortunately, they were just in too bad of shape, once again,
No.
that's both rescued, on the ground or even rescued by a helicopter.
Wow.
Sometimes that's an option, but they
Isn't
were
that
just too high on the
expensive?
mountain. A helicopter wouldn't have worked. And so once again, these two climbers were left behind to die. More and more hours passed, and eventually the survivors began to pack up their stuff at Camp 4 and get ready to climb down the mountain to finally leave this scene behind the very next morning. Spirits were low, as many of them, hadn't even really started or were trying to process the disaster that had happened. I don't know. Obviously, the mood was bad. That is, until later in the day, they saw a figure off in the distance coming down into camp. This figure would eventually make it, and frostbitten up to his forearms,
Wow.
suffering from snow blindness, and once again, literally choking on his breath, Beck Weathers, he made it back into camp. He literally stumbled back into camp, I should say. And so they did the best they could for him that night. And then the very next morning, as he was trying to kind of bring himself into a physical state where he could descend for evacuation, Beckweather's tent would end up collapsing on him and
No.
basically buried him under this snow pile. And so once again, everyone thought he was dead, and even to the point where they were like, well, we're going to have to leave. The survivors started to literally pack up and leave camp without him until John Krakauer noticed that Beckweathers was still conscious, and by some miracle, Beckweathers was able to get up and move under his own power. Over the next 2 days, a group effort worked to get him down Everest to where eventually a helicopter could land and evacuate him off the mountain. This is literally one of the most legendary survival stories in Everest history, in my opinion. Beckweathers was left for dead not once, but twice, and yet he somehow still survived. Albeit, that survival...
That's fully like the survival of the fittest. It's crazy though. I am so shocked. They left him. They didn't even check. And he did it by himself. He just said, okay, I'm gonna get down this mountain myself.
Survival came with a massive cost, right? Beckweathers, I'm just gonna put it bluntly, well, he lost a lot of body parts. He lost one of his nose, his right hand, half of his arm, and all of the fingers on his left hand.
Frostbite.
Of course, he didn't lose his life, and instead, he got one hell of a story. For that matter, so did John Krakauer. You know, again, the man up there writing this article for Outside Magazine. In fact, he would end up writing a lot more than that, because a year later, he wrote a book called Into Thin Air, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, and if you haven't, I recommend...
I have never heard of it.
Honestly, to get a way more detailed and firsthand account of this story. I've linked the book down below if any of you are curious, and the book really kind of centers around Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Once again, these two friends, but competitors and completely unique guides who battled their way up Everest time and time again. Unfortunately, it's just that this wouldn't end up being the story that Rob and Scott were hoping would be told, because ultimately they proved that summiting Everest is far less important than surviving it. To this day, people still talk about where this climb went wrong, right? I mean, there's tons of other videos on it. Some people say that it was a mishandling of the weather forecast. Some blame the guides for pushing climbers past their limits and for making some bad decisions. Some blame the Sherpas even for the delays. Some people blame Anatoly Bokriev for running ahead of everyone. And some people even blame the clients themselves. People like Sandy Pittman, for instance, once again, that socialite who was producing content for NBC. That's actually a story for another video. Coincidentally, a video that will be coming out next week. I really want to make it clear that many of the fateful decisions during this disaster were made in not only high stress environments, but literally made while people were suffering from the effects of altitude. You know, this stuff messes with your decision making, it messes with your brain. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. But with that said, I do see this disaster as yet another story about how dangerous ego can be during any kind of outdoor pursuit, especially extreme ones like this. I'm making some assumptions here, but the guides, the climbers themselves, everybody pretty much, were all driven by a bit of overconfidence to think that they could summit Everest despite the forecast, summit Everest no matter what. Even with a crazy blizzard and this time crunch, I guess I should leave it to you guys from here. Where do you guys think this climb went wrong? I mean, how could this have been avoided, or maybe at least a little less of a disaster? You guys always have the most thoughtful and insightful, respectful comments, and so I just appreciate so much when I hear your input. So please let me know what you think. I'll be reading and responding to a lot of them. And so with that said, YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next. Give it a click. And once again, I will see all of you in the next video. Thanks for being the best subscribers on YouTube. You guys are just awesome.
Wow, that was so good. Honestly, I love everything about it. Definitely check out Kyle Hates Hiking. That's an interesting way to put a name. Well, I hope you guys liked the video. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see each other next time. Bye-bye.